Hello and welcome back. This video is about importing the Quaternius Universal Animation Library, retargeting animations, and setting up a Locomotion Blend Space and animation blueprint. And a special thanks to all my supporters. Thank you for helping me help others. We're starting with a fresh Unreal Engine 5.6 third-person blueprint project named Quaternius. So to start, I'm going to create a folder named Quaternius. And linked in the description is the Universal Animation Library from Quaternius. When you've extracted and opened the zip file, you can see the contents here. The license is effectively at CC0. You can do whatever you want with it. We have an Unreal Engine setup and an Unreal Engine folder. In the setup image here, we have some instructions. We want to make sure that there's no skeleton selected. We want to make sure that use T0 as ref pose is unchecked. And then we want to check use default sample rate and snap to closest frame, but use default sample rate in 5.6 at least is named something slightly different. And then we can change the animation so that there's less jitter. In our Unreal Engine folder here, we have the AL standard FBX file. We just drag that into our folder. And in here, we only care about the information that's in animations. So in here, we're making sure that skeleton is none. Use T0 as ref pose is unchecked. And then this is the new wording for that first checkbox. Use 30 Hz to bake bone animation. We want checked. And snap to closest frame boundary. We also want checked. So once we've imported all of those, a whole bunch of files. So I'm just going to put a filter up here for animation sequence so that that's all we're showing right now. So I'm going to fast forward the video a little bit after I've deleted some of the animations that we're not going to use. So with that, we're left with jog, jump, sword attack, sword idle, and walk loop. So I'm just going to select them all again. And if we want to do the jitter correction, we can go to Asset Actions when they're all selected, and go down to Edit Selection in Property Matrix. And as usual, in a new project, I'd like to edit Preferences, go to Asset Editor Location, set to Main Window. And now we can go into our compression. So unfortunately, this is just a text field, so you have to find it. So if we go into our engine section here, we can then look for the default anim bone compression, which is right here. With that selected, then we can use the use selected asset. And then we can do that, and they're only updated if you had them selected. So let me just copy this, and we'll make sure everything is selected, and paste it in. And we're good to go. I didn't actually notice a difference with this change, so use it as you will. So back in our Quaternius folder, since you're trying to find these animations in a little window that has the names, and the name of the actual animations is at the end of these file names, I'm going to select them all again. I'm going to batch rename, and I'm just going to remove the standard anim reg underscore. So the new name will just be animation library underscore and then the name of the animation. So with that done, you can use the skeletal mesh that was included with the library. That's all fine. You just set your character up to use the skeletal mesh. However, we want to use the built-in Quinn and Manny set. So we're going to select an animation sequence. We can select them all. We can select any number. It doesn't matter because when you right-click and hit Retarget Animation, it pops up this window and it's not actually selected. So in here we have our target skeletal mesh. This is what we're retargeting towards. So for this, we're going to choose the Manny Simple Skeletal Mesh. We could choose Quinn as well, but they're kind of dependent on each other, or I think Quinn's dependent on Manny. So we're just going to use this one. Sometimes you'll get a pop-up when you're hovering over this that will show you that the skeleton used for this skeletal mesh is sk_mannequin. That'll come in handy later. So we select that, and it immediately pops up this over here. If we double click one of these, it'll show the animation between the two, and you can see how well it's working. So if we want to then just export all of these animations, we select them all, hit export animations. We choose a folder. You can put it wherever. I'm just going to put it back in the same folder. Because it's going to have the same names that are already there, it's just going to throw a 1 on the end. You could throw a prefix or a suffix on there instead if you want. When you hit export, you have this window. We don't actually want override existing. So we'll have 2 copies now of every animation. So if you did check that, then that should resolve that issue if you'd like. When we export, then you can see there's now copies of all of that animations, and it shows the Manny mesh as the icon. So with that done, we're going to create a new animation blend space. In here, instead of choosing the skeletal mesh, you're choosing the skeleton, which again, the skeletal mesh is there. Use the sk_mannequin. So we'll just call this BS, and I had a pop-up, BS_Quaternius. So in a blend space, we first want to make sure we're on asset details. You have the little chart here, and it's based on a horizontal and a vertical axis. Since we don't have strafing animations, we don't need the vertical axis. So we're just going to use a horizontal axis. We'll just call this ground speed. And because our max walk distance by default is set to 500, we'll just set that here. So then down here, we want to use our animations that we just imported. So we just filter by AL_. And at 0 movement, you'll be at idle, but we're not going to drag the idle in here directly. So we drag in our walk, and it'll drop wherever you release. So if we hold shift, you can see it goes to the grid points. The grid points are based on grid divisions up here. So if you didn't like this being at 125, you could fiddle with that a little bit. And then we'll just drag in the jog animation down here. If we hold Control and drag along this, you can see that it changes the animation based on where the speed is. So that's the jog animation, which is very bouncy. If you prefer, there's also a sprint animation in this animation library, and it's a little less bouncy. So with that done, we can move on to creating an animation blueprint. So in that case, it's used often, so it's just up here. Otherwise, it's under the animation blueprint. Similarly, you need to choose the skeleton, so we're using the mannequin. And we're calling this ABP Quaternius. And I forgot to mention back in our blend space. So if you're using a keyboard for controls in Unreal, effectively when you're stopped, you're at 0 speed. When you hit one of the arrow keys, WASD, whatever, you'll just be at 500. So there's no, like the transition from 0 to 500 is very quick. You don't really see anything. Unless, of course, you include a walk or sprint toggle. So let's do that. So then in our third person blueprint, in here, we don't care about the stuff that's in here right now. We'll just jump down to the bottom here. We're going to use the old school inputs because it's nice and quick to set up for these videos. So we're just doing left shift. And in here, we're just control dragging out our character movement, and we're calling set max walk speed. We'll just duplicate it for pressed and released. And because I like the default speed being faster, when you hold shift, you're going to set the walk speed down to the 125. And when you release, it just goes back to the default. So then in our animation blueprint, right, and up here, we want to set our animation blueprint up here. So now that I have it selected, I can just click this, and it's now ABP Quaternius. And I like to set save on compile always, and it saves. So animation blueprints are broken into 2 different graphs. We have an event graph and an anim graph. An event graph is much like you've seen before. We have our event blueprint update animation. This is effectively tick for blueprints. And then we have up here, we could do begin play or initialize animation. And that's effectively run that one time. So good for initializing stuff. And we'll do it that way. You could do it down here, just convert this to the character and get the information every tick. But instead, we're just going to convert this or cast it to the third-person character. We have a variable we're going to access in here, which is why we're using third-person character instead of just character. But in here, then we just want to promote this to a variable. Just call it character. And we also need to get the character movement. And since this is a component, once you promote this to a variable, it goes in a slightly different section down here under components. So we're just saving both of those so that down here we can just get the character by control dragging that out. We're going to validate it. It shouldn't strictly be necessary. There should be no case where this character is invalid, but it's good practice nonetheless. And we're just using this to make sure that the character and the character movement components are valid so that we can use our character movement component to get the velocity and then get the length of that velocity. Since this is our ground speed, we only need the xy value. And then we're promoting this to a variable called ground speed. And then we also want from our character movement component is falling. And we'll just save that as is to a variable called is falling. And then our anim graph, which we can get by double clicking down here, or it's up here. It's basically a bunch of state machines, states, and whatnot to control that. So we're going to start here by right-clicking. We want to type state machine. You want to put a space between state and machine just so that you can get it showing up quickly. We'll call this main. This will just be our output pose. But since we have locomotion and it's going to have its own little state machine, we can also do that up here. Call this one locomotion. And since we want to use locomotion, the results of locomotion in our main state, we then need to take the output of this and save it. So then we call new save cached pose, which we also give a name. Once that has been created, if you right click and you go to cached pose, you can see that locomotion shows up here. So you can just search for that directly, which we'll be doing in our main state here. So from our entry here, we just want to use the state, which we'll also call locomotion. In here, we're just getting that cached pose called locomotion. And that will be our default, which will be, idle, walk, run. So we can click back and forth here to go through this flow, or you can just hit the back button on your mouse. So if we go into locomotion, then we have our first state would be idle. So then here we just have an animation. Again, I'm just going to filter this by AL. And we have our idle. And we're using sort idle for this. And we go back. So now that that's been set up, our locomotion goes to idle. It saves that, goes into main. It's just doing the locomotion, which is idle, and goes in. So once we hit compile over here, we can see the default. It shows us that that idle animation has stopped. And that's because in here, we go back into idle. We click on the animation. We want to go down here to loop animation. So once that's done, it will no longer stop. Now we obviously want some motion, so we'll drag out here, we'll create a new state, we'll call this walk/jog. And in here, this is where we use our blend space. So we drag our blend space in here. And the two entries here are what you named it for the X and Y axis. We obviously are not using that, so we don't care about it. And then we're just dragging in our ground speed here. I'm just going to set this back to AL. So we go back. Now, if we run it as is now, oh, it does complain because I never set up the transition. So in this case, when we want to go from idle to walk or jog, we want to then be checking our ground speed. And we're just going to do a less than or greater than or equals. And I'm just going to set a non-zero value of 0.1. And similarly, you want to go back from walk to jog in the opposite state. So in that case, it's just going to be if your ground speed is less than 0.1. And if we run that, you can see that we have our sort of idle. And if I move around, it goes right into jog because I'm using a keyboard. If I hold down shift, then it's forcing it into the slower speed, which is the walk. So back in our main state machine, I also want to have an attack. So I'm going to drag this out here, put a state, and we'll call this attack. In here, the animation for the attack is just the sort attack. And there's no transitions for this, so that's why the compilation is giving us a warning. So back in our third person character, we can then just add another old school input for left mouse button. And all we're doing here is we're creating a variable called isAttacking. And when it's pressed, it sets attacking to true. False just resets it to, or release just resets it to false. And then back in our ABP, the transition from locomotion to attack should be if we're attacking. Now, I showed you that you can set it up in our event graph. So every tick, we're then setting the ground speed and is falling. However, that's not strictly required. In here, you also have access to this stuff, so you can then just do your character is attacking. And there we go. So similarly, hit back a few times. Going back here is when the is attacking is not set to true. So then what happens in this case is you go in here, you hit left click, and you can see that arm slightly move because I'm hitting it. If I hold it, it does the full animation until I release. And the reason why that is because it's going into that animation and starting it as soon as it hits true, but if you release, it's setting it to false, so it's going back. So if we want to prevent that and play the full animation, one way we can do that is select on this transition here, and you choose automatic rule based on sequence player in state. It's a very lengthy way of just saying play the full animation. So once that's set, two things happen. First of all, it obviously plays the full animation. And secondly, you now get a warning. The warning is just saying the automatic rule-based transition, which is this, will override the graph exit rule, which is this. So effectively, if we don't like the warning, we can delete all this or just unhook it and no warning. But what that means is then when you left click, it plays the full animation and then goes back into idle. That's kind of what we want. Similarly, right now we have our jump. So when I jump, it does nothing. If you jump and move, the move is overriding the jump. So it's just doing a normal movement for the blend space and whatnot. So for that, in our main state, we want to then drag out from our effectively our root state. We have our jump, and I'll call this one jump loop. And in here, this is the jump loop. We just drag that in. This is a loop, so we want this to loop animation. And the state here is if we're falling. So is falling is just because that's how Unreal considers jumping. Anytime you're not in the air and you're not flying, you're falling. So that's that state. We want to then go back from there. In the case where we've landed and is falling is set to false. We then just want to do a not Boolean. And that will end the animation. So we hit space, is falling becomes true. It does our jump loop until we hit the ground and stops. So now you can see it's doing it. And it doesn't look too bad because it's actually doing blending between the jump animation and the idle animation. So it's not too bad. You could leave it like that. It looks a little weird if you do multiples and whatnot, but even from running, it's not too bad. However, these animations come with jump start, and jump land. So let's use those. And if you want to save a little bit of time, if you have a state here which only has an animation, it's nothing special about it, you can also just drag them in. So it drags it in, it gives it that name. We'll just call this jump start because we don't like the full name. And also when you drag this in, it gives you that icon. You're like, oh, well, this won't work, but for whatever reason, it's set up like that, but it does work. So this is jump land. So instead, when where is falling becomes true, we want to drag this into jump start. Jump start is a relatively short animation, which we can then just set to automatically go into jump loop. And then while we're in the air, we want to keep looping this animation until we hit the ground. And at that point is when we want jump loop to go into jump land. So then similarly, when jump land is animating, we can do that. We can set the transition to use the full animation. So if you want to see that full loop, you can also just take your ABP, and if you have dual monitors, this is very handy. If you're recording a video, you don't have dual monitors, you can also just drag it out here. Make sure we can see the whole thing. So if we then hit play, we want to make sure that it's using this character. So we need to set the preview instance. If it's full screen, you can just see it's over here. If it's small like this, then it's going to be in this little drop-down area here. So we set our preview instance back to our Quaternius ABP, and then it will match this one. So you can see that when we click, it goes into attack until it's done. If we jump, it goes into jump start, but the jump start animation took almost that entire time, and then it goes in and the jump land animation takes that much time. So instead what we'll do is we'll go back into jump start. We'll just set this animation's play rate higher. So let's just make it actually just very fast. Let's just make it 4. And again, that's actually been set, it saves, which is handy. So we then forgot to set this part up so you can see it. There we go. We hit jump, it quickly goes through the start, gets into the looping, and then the land animation, the character kind of lowers down. So that all looks good, except if then you land and you start moving. So then you're still using that same animation until it's done. So one way that we can fix that is then on our exit here, instead of just using play the full animation, we can have an actual transition that says if our ground speed is greater than or equals to the 0.1 that we used earlier, then if you're standing still, it'll do the full animation. That looks fine. If you're moving, it'll override, and the jump land will actually just play for a very short period of time. So that works well enough. You may want to play around with the transitions a little bit and get it feeling, a little better for your game. And I highly recommend you go through the variants that are now included with Unreal 5.6. Some of the animations will be different between the set of them and some of the other stuff. It's a good thing to look over. Nonetheless, thanks for watching. If you liked the video and would like to see more, you know what to do. And if you would like to support this channel, watch these videos 2 weeks early, or just want to download the project files, you can do so through my Patreon linked below.